Good afternoon and welcome to Newsbrands Ireland event to celebrate International Women's Day 2022. This event is part of Newsbrands Ireland's ongoing Journalism Matters campaign to highlight and focus on the importance of journalism in a healthy society. We're here today to talk about women in journalism and the news media's approach to covering women's issues, highlighting and campaigning on behalf of issues that matter to women. I'm delighted today to be joined by an absolutely stellar lineup of women in journalism at senior levels, editors and journalists. I'm very pleased to introduce you now to Amy Mckeever, the editor of Irish Country Living, which comes out every Thursday with the Irish Farmers Journal. Also to Sheila Riley, head of editorial development with the Irish Examiner. Also to Linda Marr, who is the features editor with the Irish Daily Mail, and also via Zoom with Dr. Rebecca Whittington, online safety editor with Reach. You're all so welcome to this panel. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Nadine.
Now, to start, let's talk a little bit about how things have changed in journalism over the years. Linda, we worked together way back when in the Business Post, where I am editor of the Business Post magazine now. From your perspective, how have things changed over the years in how women's issues are covered?
I think you'll remember as well as I do the overwhelming number of men that were featured in the Business Post at the time, and because it was the business was so dominated by men at the time. But I also think that editorial it was so dominated by men too, that it felt there was certain sections that you kind of felt, oh, we'll put the women there as if it was ticking a box. And I think that sense is definitely gone, not only from the Business Post, but I think across all newspapers. I think it's so important now that, because women are, when women are reading the newspapers, they want to see themselves represented, and that wasn't happening for a long, long time. But I think a lot of that was to do with the women that were behind the scenes, the lack of women behind the scenes as women wanting to tell their stories as well. So I think there's, across the board, across almost every newspaper in the country now, there are so many women in high-level positions, and it makes an absolutely huge difference to the content that's getting covered, the feeling that women have that they can trust newspapers now, and that those newspapers want to tell their stories, because for a long time I think they didn't.
What are the stories that you've felt particularly passionately about in recent years that would have had a connection to specifically female issues?
I think cervical check is the huge one for every woman in the country. That I'm not sure that would have got the kind of coverage, the kind of leverage that it got even 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I don't think it would have got that kind of leverage. And it's also thanks to people like Vicky Phelan being able to stand up and feel that her voice was powerful enough to be heard, because women didn't feel that way 15, 20 years ago. Now we feel like not only do we have a voice, but people want to hear it as well. So I think that was a huge one. I think the women in the Defence Forces story is huge at the moment. Tune babies, like the list is kind of endless. And even just, this week alone watching the piece on RTE about the Magdalene laundries, and it's still so prevalent, not prevalent in that it's still happening, but the sentiment that how unfair this all was is still there, and people still want to hear things about it to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Sheila, it's about representation, isn't it? And Linda was talking there about really having a place at the table, a voice in the editorial meeting. And is that something you've been very conscious of through your career, that in order to appeal and show audiences clearly how Ireland looks at inner levels, women have to be well represented?
Absolutely, I think that's so important, for sure. And women need to look at these newspapers, at news outlets, and know that their stories are going to be represented by people just like them. In lots of ways, it's the same issue that has kind of been prevalent in politics for such a long, long time, with that kind of the lack of visible women and how that impacts either the topics covered, the topics brought to the political table, and also then the issues that are debated. So that, in a way, is mirrored completely in news. And what we have seen over the years, we've seen an increase in the number of women journalists coming through, and that's absolutely fantastic. I started 20 years ago, and there was always maybe 1 or 2 women in local newspaper newsrooms, and that was it. But now that has actually greatly enhanced throughout the local industry, the national industry as well. And we're nearly at like 40%, nearly 50% of women in a lot of places. But the reality is that once you start to move up the hierarchy, there's less and less women in kind of the editorial roles and also in the senior governance roles. And that change is dripping slow in that regard. And often that can be because, and Linda kind of touched on this, I thought, very well when she was speaking there, you know, the women in the past, and still to a degree, can kind of find themselves sort of pushed into certain areas of journalism, in certain areas of reporting, and that the areas where, like the hard news, politics, economics, sometimes that can be quite male dominated even today, and that they are the type of areas that you work in that people get promoted from, if you like, that you move up through the scales from those areas in particular. There's a bit of work to be done in relation to that now, in terms of getting more people up the ranks through from a variety of areas in news outlets. That's very, very important. The value of politics, economics, business, all that, they're absolutely, of course, they're crucial, but still we do kind of look at areas beyond those as a little bit sort of lesser, and I think we have a bit of work to do in terms of changing attitudes on that.
You have an interesting job title, Head of Editorial Development. That's a role that probably didn't exist in newspapers.
I'm sure it didn't.
Some years back. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Oh God, almighty, it's a very multifaceted role, to be fair. It covers a lot, predominantly digital, to be honest, which is very kind of exciting and fast-paced end of it, but also a lot of strategy and project development within the Examiner, which is great because we've worked on a number of really fantastic initiatives. I'm only there about 18 months, and I still some days feel like I'm still only getting my feet under the table, but it's a fantastic role in that regard because you're working kind of on these great projects, but also very much operationally on day-to-day what's going on the site. I think you're right in a way. It's interesting when you say a role wouldn't have existed. I don't think this role actually existed 3 or 4 years ago in the Examiner. I think the previous person who did it was Tom Fitzpatrick, who's the editor of the Examiner now. And you have seen in recent years the creation of a lot of new roles in news that didn't exist, that reflect kind of the digital sphere in particular, and that's an area that traditionally was quite dominated by men in itself, and that has shifted now, and I'm seeing myself a lot more younger, certainly in the Examiner, a lot of younger, very digitally focused female journalists coming up through, which is fantastic to see, because that voice was a little bit diminished there for a while, but we are seeing that that's absolutely changing now, which is great.
Yeah. Well, Amy, obviously with your work with the Irish Country Living and the Irish Farmers Journal, you tap into a market that not every newspaper or magazine can manage. Yeah. And it is a more perhaps traditional conservative market. So can you tell me a little bit about how you commission and edit to that audience and represent that audience well, and then also from the perspective of commissioning, do you think a lot about the balancing of gender, how you decide what subjects to cover? It's very multifaceted, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I suppose the Irish Farmers Journal, you know, we do talk to a rural audience, and predominantly, I suppose there is a perception, and you know, the International Women's Day, the topic this year is breaking the bias, and there would be a bias in rural Ireland towards thinking that it's that particularly agriculture and the area that we work in would be a very male-dominated area. I suppose just when we're talking about females in the news teams across agriculture, like the Examiner has Rachel, and the Independent has Margaret, and we have Katrina as our news editors, with 3 females across the agricultural sphere, which I suppose is a massive development in comparison to previous years. But my section of the paper, I suppose, Irish Country Living, we would have grown up, I suppose, being put into that box as the women's section. And I do occasionally still have people say to me that it's the women's section, which is very much, I suppose, not. We've branched out as well. We have a glossy magazine, which now sits on shelf on its own, Irish Country Magazine, which is separate to the paper. And I think that the important thing about Irish Country Living in terms of, we've in farming we had patrilineal inheritance. Men inherited farms, but the paper was not necessarily brought into the house by the males. It's brought into the house by women, the people that were out in the shops. We do have a mixed 50-50, nearly 50-50 purchasing of the paper. And the idea behind it is to have that everybody would have their own area. And we do have lots of issues in rural Ireland in terms of isolation, in terms of education, in terms of access to information. And there would have been a lot of problems for women, and Irish Country Living was an area, well, it was called Journal 3 at one stage, but that's a while ago. But it would have been a way for people to get information that otherwise they might not have been able to access in terms of women's issues, you know what I mean? Where things like the menopause, women's pensions, succession planning, these things weren't discussed in maybe the mainstream media because it's specific to rural women, rurals, and Irish Country Living was a voice, and it was an acceptable place to be reading. And then, of course, there was plenty of, we've always had women, and we have a lot of men now that write to us. And sometimes a lot of the letters that I will get and a lot of the correspondence I will get is, please don't identify me. You know what I mean? And there is an element of fear, and you can always hear that in the letters. I get handwritten letters day in, day out. And we try to address those through, we've a number of different ways that we address those through the papers. So we have a solicitor, Aisling Meehan, who responds to readers' queries, and we'll anonymise everything and try to make it so that, you know, it can be more generalised. But a lot of these would be specific queries. We also have a problem page on the back of the paper, which people, both sexes read. It's very well read, and I get a lot of correspondence, but those are actually real letters. They're real problems. Some of them are very, you know, are light touch, but some of those problems are very serious, and some of those problems that come in we don't print in the paper because they're too specific, and we will send them to the psychotherapists and other people that we work with. And then mental health is another very large problem in rural Ireland. You know, in terms of young people, we have high suicide rates, young men and women, and trying to address those issues is something that we're constantly trying to do. Particularly when COVID started, we had cocooning, and I know you can say, like, you know, you can be isolated in a tower block surrounded by people, but if you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's nobody calling to you, and you're an older person and you're afraid, and we have violence as well, it's a hard place to be. So trying to support people in those ways and give them an opportunity to write in. And, you know what I mean, it could be a case of picking up the phone and getting a neighbour to call into them afterwards, that kind of rural engagement. We do as well, we do a lot of, pre-COVID, we did a lot of events. I would have gone out and spoken to people. So I suppose having that direct contact with our readership has always been important. And due to the nature of the paper, I suppose we're able to do that. We have our, I'm just speaking of Vicky, feeling like we had Vicky speak at our conference, our Women in Agriculture conference 2 years ago. So the last time we had it, she's unbelievable. Like, you know what I mean? Like the voice that Vicky has given to women, you know what I mean? We have a responsibility to report it, considering the fact that she put herself out there to achieve what she did for women in Ireland.
Yeah. So. And I should say as well, your magazine won the Magazine of the Year in 2021, so congratulations.
Thank you.
On that. And, you know, I believe the judges were saying, you know, completely punching above its weight and providing a range of subjects that the audience immediately wanted to engage with. Can you tell me a little bit about the balance? Because you've spoken a bit there about some of the issues that are facing just the people who would pick up the magazine and pick up the Irish Farmers Journal, but to bring people on, to progress, to reflect the Ireland of the here and now, while also being attentive to the audience that you have and potentially more traditional beliefs, that does strike me as a very tricky balance. So
when it comes to some of the, I suppose, we do have conservative readers, but we also are, rural Ireland is moving on. It is actually a progressive place. And as time, now we don't have, in rural Ireland, there wouldn't be a huge amount of diversity in terms of race, but we do have other types of diversity. And I think that but it is changing, and trying to introduce those faces into the paper, putting them on our cover, putting them on the front of the Farmers Journal, and giving people an opportunity to speak about how we're the same, different but the same, because people quite often identify with that voice. Like I just wrote a piece. We had a group from, they're not direct provision, they're an EROC centre in Ballahadreen come out to Tullamore Farm, our farm, to visit. And it was organised through Mckeever, the Young Farmers Organisation, because they've set up a community. They want to encourage more community, and they think, well, farming is something that no matter where you're from, you're going to have some form of farming. It mightn't be exactly the same, but it'd be similar. And they came out, and I was speaking to some of the young people that were there for the paper, and I said, oh, so what was life like in Syria when you were there? And he just said, it's the same. Went to school, played football, same as here. And I think that for somebody in rural Ireland then to read that, when I was in Syria, went to school, played football, it's the same. They're the same people, it's a different language, but they're here now and they're trying to fit into communities. And anything we can do to make those first introductions through the paper, I think, is important. It's the same as kind of like with our Pride edition. Sometimes there can be a feeling like, oh, you know, people are jumping on a bandwagon here. You know what I mean? Kind of, oh, everybody's doing this. This group is involved and that group is involved. And the paper has to appeal to everybody. You know what I mean? You have different people with different interests. So what I try to do in terms of direction is to introduce something different, but in the same format that we would always do it. So people the paper is the same format. It might just have it just had somebody else's story. And hopefully then they see, oh, you know what I mean? Sure, they're doing what I'm doing. And then when people meet each other, then it's just very normal. Yeah.
Well, Rebecca, to bring you in, we've talked a little bit about online and the way in which journalism has fundamentally experienced a paradigm shift now that we have moved into this world where news is instantly accessible, and often journalists are instantly accessible via their Twitter feeds or their Instagram or their LinkedIn. And that accessibility can be phenomenal. It can create a better newspaper, it can create a better environment, it can make us think very well about topics, but it also leaves people very open sometimes and very vulnerable to online hate. So can you tell me a little bit about your particular role in relation to those areas? Because again, as with Sheila, I'm not sure your role would have existed some years ago.
No, I don't think it would have done. I mean, it's my role with Reach Online Safety Editor is the first role of its kind in the UK, and really actually internationally we're seeing new roles like this now being established, but actually there hasn't been that much up until very recently, working specifically to look at online abuse and harassment of journalists, which is what my role is. So I work within Reach, which has more than 3,000 journalists across the UK and Ireland as well. And within that, we obviously use the internet, use digital tools all the time for our work. And like you say, there is just wonderful opportunities and benefits being offered by those digital tools, not least being able to actually reflect a more diverse voice of people, more diverse groups within our communities, not always drawing on the same sources. Journalism is much less elitist than it used to be, which I think is good. You know, it's no longer what we saw. We've just talked about, you know, men telling other people what the news is. We're much more seeing a diversification of voices within journalism. So those are all the benefits. But then obviously the downsides to that come with it, that you are perhaps as a journalist more on show than has ever been before. You know, previously we did have that. We had a platform that we used and we kind of broadcast the news outwards and didn't have that two-way conversation. And now we are much more accessible within our journalistic roles. There are benefits to that, like we talked about, but obviously the downsides are that it means that people have access to us to tell us exactly what they think all the time. And that people can also access journalists to abuse them, to harass them, and other online harms as well. So my role is very much about trying to maximise the opportunities that are offered by online spaces and online platforms for journalists, whilst also driving down those negatives that come in hand with that. And if we look at women in particular, we do see, we know anecdotally and also from research that's been done, for example, by UNESCO, that women journalists are facing a huge amount of online abuse, that there's extreme misogyny and quite a lot of really unpleasant threats being made, and this is having an impact journalism, it's having an impact on female voices, and it's having an impact on female stories as well. So it's really, really important that actually we're creating safe spaces for women to produce journalism, and also to be included within journalistic stories and topics. So it's not just the journalists, it's also sometimes the people who are the subject of the story that are being abused online in this way. So it's a huge challenge, I would say, because I think as a society, the way that we've adapted to use online tools is quite an organic change that's happened over time, and that's obviously reflected in the way that journalism has kind of organically changed to become more digital, and then the rules that maybe we should have established at the start, we maybe didn't know that we needed to set those ground rules, and now we're trying to kind of shut the door once the horse has bolted, so to speak. So that's very much what my job is, and it's a very practical job that I support people when something happens to them. So if a journalist gets in touch with me to say that they have been abused online, that they've received some threats or whatever it is that they're reporting to me, I work with that individual to support them, work with their team and their manager as well to make sure they're getting the support locally that they need. But then also there's huge amounts of strategy within my work, actually trying to identify what training we need to be giving people, how they can keep themselves safe online, how we expect our journalists to be working, and how we expect the online audience to also be responding to our journalists and keeping our online spaces safe for everybody to use. So I've been in the role for 3 months, and it's you know, it's a huge job, but it's a really good job, because actually I do feel like we can make some really positive change, not just for journalism, but actually for our society more generally as well.
I'd imagine there are some women that will come to you and say, listen, I'm just going to go off Twitter, I'm going to go off social media because I cannot cope with the volume of abuse that I'm getting. I cannot cope with going home at night and trying to switch off and then discovering that somebody has written something about you know, something not even connected to journalism, potentially about appearance or other aspects. What do you say to them? Because if women become silenced on social media, then we experience a systemic problem all over again, you know, one that we've spent generations trying to correct, where women get to have a voice and get to be fairly represented at the table.
Absolutely. I mean, it is really difficult. I think in the individual situation, obviously, if somebody needs some time away from social media, we should be affording them that, because that's what we need to do for mental health and well-being of our journalists, whoever it is that suffered online abuse. But I completely agree that we need to be making sure that women's voices are being heard, and if our response is to just shut down and step back and not work in those spaces, then those spaces lose any diversity that can be represented through them. And it's not just women, it's, you know, it's all kinds of diversity, but women's voices obviously is a huge, you know, it's a huge number of people that we want to be keeping online to actually represent those diverse stories and those women's stories. So I would say, you know, in the long term, I would always encourage somebody to come back into those online spaces. Obviously, the individual case, I would always want to make sure that they had the protections that they needed. So there's really practical things that we can do in terms of creating that divide between our professional lives and our private lives. So how we operate online, the information that we give away about ourselves, I think is really important to consider. The settings that we have on our private social media pages, I would say always check your settings, check them once a month, make sure that, you know, you are keeping your private life as private as possible. So that information can't be found, stolen, used against you, because we do see a lot of that. We see doxing take place, which essentially is where private information, private images might be taken from someone's private accounts and then misused against them, repurposed, kind of tweeted out, people tagged in, you know, it makes you more vulnerable online. So obviously there's really practical things that we can do. So we take a look at the individual case, see how we can make that person safer online. But ultimately I want people to be feeling confident to use online tools, and women to be confident using online platforms to promote and produce their journalism, because if we don't give them that confidence, and if we don't give that support and security, then like you say, those voices will just disappear, and then actually the trolls win, and the people who are creating online violence and hate against women win, and society does not win as part of that, definitely doesn't. So it is difficult, because I think the individual experience can sometimes be very damaging, but actually a big part of my role is about working with those individuals to actually regain that confidence to actually work in those spaces. And obviously there is there's a job here for the platforms as well. So a lot of the platforms that we use are external platforms, social media platforms. We need to be making sure that they are, doing as much as they can as well. And I think that there's work to be done in that area. But I would say, for example, Twitter is doing some quite good work around protecting female journalists, female voices online. So there are steps being taken forwards. And I also feel like if it was just me doing this work, then it would be difficult for me to have power over those external bodies. But actually, because we're seeing this conversation being had, we're having it now, it's being had internationally, at international levels, and there's a lot of research and work being done in this particular area around online safety and online safety of women. And the UNESCO report and research is really interesting to go and have a look at. Would really recommend that. But there's really good steps forward. And actually collaboratively, I do feel like there is an opportunity to make change, because they can't keep ignoring these issues, and we can't as a society keep ignoring these issues.
For sure. Well, Linda, to bring you in, what is your take on social media, and particularly not just for yourself but also for the journalists that you commission, and for how it plays out in a very real way? The pages of the Irish Daily Mail then go online, then you get feedback, and presumably there must have been times when things have been pretty tricky.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's always the days where you do a story that, means something, has a result, actually gets things moving, and the joy of that is incredible. And to see something like that online, when you have parents of children who've been denied, say, access to SNAs, and suddenly they've finally got a breakthrough because of coverage in the media, and days like that are brilliant. But there is the downside of it, and it is tough, and you're trying to strike a balance between, you want the conversation and you don't want the conversation all on your terms. That's not how it works. But when it turns into abuse, that's a totally different, it's a different level, and it's difficult. It's difficult to then convince people to write for you, because they see what's happened to other journalists who've written for you. So it's very difficult to find that balance. And of course you want to have conversations, and you want to get feedback from people. You want to see, can we move this story on even further? Is there more to this? But when it gets caught up in abuse and, just derogatory language, and it's very, very difficult. I don't want to be saying to anybody who writes to me, well, look, if you put this out online, you have to have a thick skin. Like, that's not how it should work. That's not.
Do you say that though?
No, I would, and I never want to feel, because somebody who wants to tweet out a story that they've worked hard on, have put a lot of effort into, and they wanted to get it. You want a story, every story you publish, every story you research, every story you print, you want to get the widest viewing possible. And, you start that with the paper the next morning, but then, that only reaches so far. Then you have to start trying to, well, how can we get this further? You're putting it on Facebook, you're putting it on Twitter, Instagram to a point, but I don't ever say that, and I don't ever want to have to say that to somebody. If a journalist came to me and said they weren't particularly happy about tweeting it out online, I'm more than happy to do it myself, or from the official newspaper account, and that kind of takes out a middleman a bit. And I think especially the official account, because it's less targeted then, so people there actually tends to be less abuse on.
Yeah, well, there are also some stories that are, very well sort of served by existing in a double-page spread, for example, but that if you reduce them to a headline, which is often the only thing people see on Twitter, it can create immediate aggression or negativity, and sometimes in a misinformed way. And listen, we should say it's always fair enough, as you were saying, to have the conversation, and there will always be a dialogue. Journalists aren't right all the time any more than readers are right all the time. So that's important too. But when it tips over, it can be very distressing. But do you occasionally make the decision to say, look, this is a story that lives really well within the pages, but we won't serve anyone well if we tweet it out in a very bold, headline-y type style.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense, and like we were saying, like we crave that interaction. You crave that interaction, and for so many years, newspapers never had that interaction because someone bought it. You didn't know who was buying. You didn't know who the person was. You didn't know how they felt. You didn't know if they completely identified with the story, if they completely disagreed with it. You had no idea. Now you have, and it's absolutely brilliant to have that. That kind of immediate feedback is, you know, it's central to everything you then decide on what to do the next day. But as you say, a lot of the time there is, you know, the people who read the headline, the first paragraph, and then jump straight in, and that can be very dangerous. You'd like to think, you know, if enough comments come in going, read the actual story, that it will get through, but, you know.
You've got the voice of somebody who said that a lot, you know, read the story.
Read the actual story. And, you know, but you're caught in, you know, things like, you know, as we all were introduced to in the past, the SEOs and, you know, what's going to work for getting this story searched and how this is going to make this story come up when people search for something specific to it. And that's where you can run into a few issues. So, as you know, and especially on the Daily Mail, the Irish Daily Mail Twitter account, it's editorial in terms of who's overseeing how it's put up. So it's not somebody with a digital eye on things. It's not somebody looking for SEO. So we want to maintain that kind of control over it, because obviously people who work in digital have a totally different mindset to how we can get more hits on this. So you definitely have to find the balance between the two. But there is I absolutely love and feed off the feedback you get every day now on a newspaper that you never had before, and I think it's a very, very good thing with huge downsides.
Yeah, well, it is a good thing with downsides, but at the same time there are certain stories that are so sensitive and so hard to cover, and we've seen a number of them in the past couple of years with, you know, family suicides, for example, or murder-suicide cases, and those stories, it used to be years ago you would cover them and that would be more or less the end of it, whereas now with the kind of weaponization of online culture, people can easily search out addresses, they can travel to addresses. You know, there's a huge climate, I guess, of possibility for readers now in a way that didn't really exist previously. So do you sometimes think about that in terms of the images that you use, or the language that you use in terms of framing these stories? Because there probably does need to be a little bit of, you know, thought as to exactly how sometimes victims of whether it's violence or anything else are covered in the modern era. Because even if you look at court cases, you know, the day of, you know, printing names and addresses in the newspaper, that's a very different reality in the modern world, where people can go online to Google and to Google Maps.
Yeah, well, so first of all, and it does happen still quite a lot, that a family or, you know, somebody you're interviewing might say, I don't want this to go online. And you absolutely 100% abide by that. You wouldn't dream of ever breaking that promise to them. This, you know, they're happy enough for it to be in paper, they don't want it to go online. And a lot of that is because they're afraid of the comments that will be underneath it, and that's absolutely fair. And, you know, we all know, you know, what damage can be done by some of those comments that people make as a throwaway, the long-term damage that can be done. In terms of in pictures, you're always so careful, especially if children are involved. It's you know, there's 3, 4, 5 people involved in deciding which pictures are going to be used here. A lot of the time it will be pictures sent to you by the person you're interviewing, so at least you know you're covered on their side of things. If it comes to where it's a news story and they don't have control over the narrative, again, you have to think things of the house. Do we put a picture of the house in?
Yep.
You know, and just because you think this looks like a very normal house, someone who lives in that area, but also they could be getting one piece of information from your paper, they could be getting another piece of information from another paper, they could be getting another piece of information from Twitter, and putting it all together if they have bad intents and this is what they want to do. So you kind of can't cover yourself from all angles, but the best you can do is to kind of, and it's kind of thinking, if this was me, how would I feel? What would I, you know, what would I be comfortable with being covered here?
Yeah.
But the safety of the people you're interviewing is always paramount.
And Sheila, have you had that 3 in the morning moment where you've woken up and gone, oh my God, we need to remove this, change this, fix that, for safety, for protection?
Doesn't everybody have that? I think so, yeah. I think people are far more conscious of it now than ever before. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The digital space has opened things up in a way that you've just described really well, Nadine, and but it's also kind of democratized it in another way too. You know, you do have, as you said, kind of that immediacy, you know, the immediate reaction, and it's fantastic. And it is kind of about containing that and getting that right, you know. Like, I see social as, which we would use a lot, obviously everybody does in news now, but I see it as a great tool, to be honest, in lots of ways, and a really fantastic journalism tool, investigative tool. And like, we used really effectively last year, I thought, in the Examiner for a piece we did about miscarriage, where we asked people to submit their own experience of miscarriage, and via social, did a jot form, threw it out there. Like, we got unbelievable responses from people about their experience, about what they had gone through, and that. And same with menopause. And these are topics that people, possibly women in particular, wouldn't have felt safe talking about in the past, or wouldn't have felt that it was a kind of a comfortable space for them. And yet they're using, you know, social brings it out to them, and then they come into us, and it's fantastic to be able to use digital in that way, and to see it kind of bringing positive, important stories to light. You are being a really fantastic news gathering tool. Not to say there's not negatives with it, but to see it being used in that way is really kind of positive and affirmative, and that's what you want to be able to get out of digital, and that's where you want digital to be in that way. And naturally, and of course, there's the scenarios where you are waking at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're thinking about, oh my gosh.
Are you even in journalism if you haven't had one?
You're not, and that's the truth of it. But always at the top of your mind, no matter what story you're covering, the safety of people who you are covering is paramount, but also the safety of your journalists, the people who are working for you and who are out and about, you know, are out and about, putting their faces out there, putting themselves out there, and particularly on social. And it is a very difficult space. I think the platforms need to do a lot more to protect journalists who are out there, and to protect people in general in terms of trolling.
And they would say they're not publishers, they're platforms.
That's convenient for them, Nadine, to say that.
Well, it gives them a lot more licence to do a lot more than the Irish libel laws would allow newspapers to do. Is this at all fair?
No, I don't think it is, because I think it's a convenient way for them to get around what is the reality of it. They are facilitating the publication of content which is totally and utterly unacceptable, and they don't move fast enough to take it down, particularly when they're targeting individuals, be they people in the media or people who are not in the media. It doesn't matter. You know, they still need to do a hell of a lot more in terms of addressing this issue, because the reality is, we as users, as social media users, can only do so much, and yet the space is where a lot of people live, work, occupy that space at the minute, and there is so much positive aspects, so many positive aspects to it. That's the kind of the killer nearly in relation to it. But the double edge of that sword is the fact that, you know, trolls are out there. There's a lot of people who just seem to take a lot of joy out of abusing people online, particularly women, and that the reality is that women are particularly vulnerable online, and that they are the ones who receive kind of completely and utterly misogynistic, totally and utterly acceptable levels of abuse. We see that time and time again, far greater than men do, and yet not enough is kind of done on the platform side, I think, to address that. And I think as well that we as social media users ourselves need to show a lot more solidarity when we see women getting abused online, be again they women in media or women outside of the space, because it's very important to show that solidarity, to show that this is not acceptable, this is not an acceptable use of this space. And if that's what you want to do, you need to be out of this space. Like the killer about when you talk about women, you know, that they might want to step back from Twitter, like you asked Rebecca there. Like we have hundreds and hundreds of years of experience of people trying to silence women's voices, and now here this is just another aspect of it. But now all it has is it's adopted for the modern day era, if you like. So when you see people saying, oh, I'm coming off Twitter for a while, like you can understand why that happens, but at the same time that is a loss to us all, not just to that person, because they've only lost Twitter, like it's not the end of the world, but you know what I mean, it is a loss. Yeah. It's that space is getting smaller. and our space is getting more and more diminished all the time. And as women, we understand what it is to live in diminished space. We understand, you know, that thinking about your space, where you go, what you do, all of the time. You're always double thinking that. Anyway, and then to be in social, you're still, that people are still doing that, even though that's a virtual space now. Like, it's completely unacceptable. And in one way, we're seeing the start of this now when you're hearing the feedback from Metaverse, which often can be quite negative space for women too. And this is now the new dimension of social, new dimension of the virtual world. And already it's becoming, or already there are reports that it is not a friendly space for women. So we need to kind of stand back and ask ourselves, well, why is that? And more action needs to be taken from us as users. I think people need to realise their own power as users as well, not just the platforms themselves, who need to do an awful lot more for women too.
You're talking about allyship in a way, about reaching out and being, you know, comrades with the women, which I think is so important. If you see a woman being trolled online, there is a tendency at the start, I think maybe a couple of years ago, where people would say, oh, it has nothing to do with me. They'd kind of watch it like it was cricket or something. You know, whereas now I think people do understand, no, this has everything to do with you. It's just happenstance that it's not you.
Yeah, it's not you today, but tomorrow it could be, yeah, and that you need to take a stance for somebody else, to shout out for somebody else. That is a really important thing to do, an important place to be, you know, to show that solidarity for women. And I think in the media, often because we all work for different outlets, and naturally enough, we're all in competition with each other in the reality. But at the same time, there's a good, strong network there too, a good, strong female-led network actually as well, as more and more people are coming through in working, as more and more women are working in media, and as I said earlier, progressing up through the ranks, and it is brilliant to see. That network is developing. It's much stronger, I feel, than it would have been when I got into journalism first. You know, I was an editor in 2006, I think it was, and I was an unusual person. You know, I was unusual in local journalism, particularly. There wasn't too many female editors around there at that stage. So, in that regard, it's kind of good to see. It's good to see kind of. It's good to see that there is, that network has developed, there is that solidarity development, but there's probably not enough of it out there in general, and that awareness in the general public needs to be raised, I think, as well.
I think that this, with the social media element of it, it's not like this is a problem on social media. This has been allowed to manifest in the real world, and there wasn't enough women and men saying no. And no, you know what I mean? We didn't stop the language in the real world, and I think it is beginning to, you know, it's beginning to become a lot more socially unacceptable. But there's still women out there every single day who don't stand up for themselves, who think that their careers are going to be jeopardised if they go against behaviour that's not acceptable, that the language that's used, and it's still used. And until that stops as well, when you have invisible people on social media who actually, you know what I mean, can hide behind social and it's nameless, they're never going to stop saying whatever they want to say. We need the real world and print and every other kind of publication to respect women. And that's where it starts, respecting women. And then, you know what I mean, and social then, and I would totally agree with that. As women, we need to support each other more.
Well, we don't have too much more time left, but I wanted to close with a question to you all. What advice would you give to a very young, hoped to be female journalist coming up through the ranks, whether in secondary school or in college, and about to enter into the world of journalism? What would you say to that person?
I'd say go for it. It's an absolutely fantastic career. It's brilliant. It can you can change lives. It's hugely rewarding. It's you know, you can do so much for the people you meet. You can break down systemic failures. You can highlight, you know, expose terrible things, undo great wrongs. It's an incredible career, so varied and so interesting. I would highly recommend it as a career. I think it's amazing.
Rebecca, what about yourself?
Yep, I totally echo that. It is just the most exciting career. No day is the same. You get to work with some amazing people, meet amazing people, tell amazing stories, and actually the world is your oyster, and you have access to the world because of all these amazing digital tools and platforms that we can use. We should be going out there, you should be going out there and working with those, and have the support of your peers and society and everybody around you to actually go out and do that. And that's why it's so important, the roles that we're all doing in actually encouraging those young women into this kind of career and giving them the confidence and the head start that they need to then, you know, forge the future path, I guess. So,
Linda?
Yeah, I think as well, talk to the women around you, talk to the women of your own age, talk to the women at home, find out what they want to read. Is there something they feel is missing? And, you know, and then follow those stories, because just because you don't see something doesn't mean people don't want to read it. So, you know, and that's how you can find a different outlet for what you want to do. But I absolutely agree, it's one of the most rewarding careers there is.
And Amy?
Network. Network. No, but I just think in terms of diversity of thought as well, though, that you have to be open to meeting new people all the time, because then you're learning. And just because you thought something was this way and you wrote about it a year ago and it was this way, that's not to say that you can't learn, move on and come back with a different viewpoint on that, depending on the amazing people that we do get to meet as journalists, which is what makes it such an amazing job.
So one question to you all: why does journalism matter for women particularly?
I think journalism is just, it's a voice. It's, you know, every single paper, every single day is filled with voices, whether it's the voice of a government, whether it's, you know, a voice of a man on the street. It's just voices. And women have had their voice taken from them for so long that it's an outlet that doesn't discriminate, wants to hear your stories, and so tell your story, and they will. It's funny, you know, when you hear if somebody's given out about something, you always hear someone saying, "Oh, you should ring Joe Duffy," and you know, because and there's an element of truth to it, because people want to hear stories. Like, so if you feel you have a story, your story should be told, tell it to somebody, and journalists will listen.
Sheila?
Yeah, I think why journalism matters for women is that increasingly journalism is telling the stories of women, telling women's stories in the way and on the platforms that they connect with and that they understand, covering more and more topics that are important to women that in the past would have been kind of seen as lesser or less important, or not, or maybe stigmatized, like rape, like violence against women, which we now know is a major topic this year. It has existed since the beginning of time, but we are now coming out and people are talking more candidly about their experiences of violence, of harassment, of domestic abuse and all of that. And that's all part of journalism, bringing these important topics out for people and raising the temperature on them and putting the spotlight to make people aware that these are out there. I think that's so important that we are covering these topics that have kind of been not covered properly, or were kind of put to the side, like the mother and baby homes. Like the Examiner were doing huge work in the mother and baby homes over a long number of years, and it's really kind of through all, you know, it's really only now that people are kind of looking back and focusing on you know, that they connect, if you like, with how horrible an experience that was. And I think part of the reason with that is that more and more of those women started to come out and tell their stories themselves in their own words, and they were doing that through news outlets, and that's how they were coming out. And I think that's really important. That's one kind of concrete example for me of how I've seen that manifest itself, but in many other different ways across loads of topics. And that's the important part, is you're seeing more women related topics on the agenda for a reason, because people now realise how important these are. And even the topics that we're covering every day, like education and health and all of those topics, that we're looking at them with a gender lens, which wouldn't have happened previously before. And that's really why.
I think helping women to identify with other women, that it's not a case, you know, that feeling alone, like this is my problem, I have to keep it to myself because there isn't anybody else out there, and that maybe they haven't been able to have a discussion about a problem that they have. And I think it's telling the stories of very ordinary women who are going through probably all very much the same problems, and then other women can identify, and that's when you start to have change happen. And because sometimes I think that, you know what I mean, looking up to people that are too far away from where you are right now, a woman might think, well, she was able to do that, but I'm not. Whereas the more stories and the more ordinary everyday women that are telling their stories, the more other women would be able to identify, and that will help women to climb the ladder, better equality, gender pay gap, any kind of, you know, health, you know, education, all very important. And I think women's voices being in the media is so important.
Yeah. And Rebecca?
Yeah, I totally echo all of those points that have just been made. I mean, essentially, journalism should be reflecting our society, and so it's really important that women's voices are having, really being heard, that that women's stories are being represented, and that women journalists are having the opportunity to actually take that role as well, and that people are seeing that women journalists are doing that. I think it's not just about the voices that are being heard, but it's also who's telling those stories and who's giving, that coverage as well. It's so important that we continue to do that, and that we continue not to be silenced, that those voices are, that we're celebrating them, that we're sharing stories and actually talking more about the big issues that are facing women and our society as a result, because really ultimately women and their allies, we want to be seeing those voices coming through, and we want to encourage the next generation to be able to do the same.
Well, we'll leave it there, but Amy Mckeever, Sheila Riley, Linda Marr and Rebecca Whittington, thank you so much for your time today. It's very much appreciated on International Women's Day.